We're halfway through the Ixalan spoiler, so let's start taking a look at what cards are modern playable. First up, we have Opt. At the moment, people seem to be really polarized about this card, with some people saying that it's worse than Seaman Visions because it only has Scry 1 as opposed to Scry 2. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have people saying that it's better because it's an instant, but as with most new cards, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But I do think that Opt will definitely see play in decks that act at instant speed. And the first deck that comes to mind would be Blue-Red Control, like Blue Moon or Blue-Red Through the Breach, because both of those decks rely on leaving lands open so that they can counter things on the opponent's turn. And I think the biggest benefit of having Opt in the deck is the ability to use Spell Snare much more effectively, because Spell Snare is a really good card that takes out a lot of modern staples. But the downside to Spell Snare is that you have to time it just right. So for example, let's say your opponent's on the play, they play land turn 1, pass to you, and in your opening hand you have Spell Snare and Seaman Visions. And the question is, do you play the Visions turn 1, or do you leave that mana open for Spell Snare? And it's a very tough choice, because if you drop the Visions turn 1, it likely means that your next few draws will be of high quality. But on the other hand, next turn your opponent could play something like Tarmogoyf, Dark Confidant, Eidolon, all these good cards that cost 2 mana, and maybe Spell Snare is your only answer that you have for those cards. So there's a big incentive to keep the land open for Spell Snare, but then on the downside, what if they don't play anything on their turn? Or they play 2 things that cost 1, in which case you wish you would have played Seaman Visions instead. But now with Opt, you don't have to make that choice because Opt's an instant. So you can leave that 1 mana open for Spell Snare, and if your opponent doesn't do anything, you can still use that mana to drop Opt. And the same concept works later in the game when you have Snapcaster. You can play Snapcaster on your opponent's turn, and you can flashback Opt. But I don't think Opt will replace Visions in all decks, because there are some decks like Delver where you need to have the scry after the draw, and in combo decks, having that extra scry really does make a difference. So in short, Opt will see some play in instant speed decks, but it won't replace Seaman Visions entirely. But it is time to move on to the next card, and the next card is Coppola. And the question everybody has is, how does it compare to Kira, which sees a lot of play in Merfolk decks? And let's just be straightforward about things. Coppola's ability is just worse. For example, let's say your opponent has a Lightning Bolt. For 3 mana, they Lightning Bolt Coppola, and that's it. Whereas with Kira, they would need to have 2 removal cards in the same turn to kill Kira, which is much harder to pull off. But Coppola may still see play because Coppola is a Merfolk and Kira is not, and the question then becomes, does the fact that Coppola is a Merfolk make up for its worst ability? And I think that a lot of Merfolk players will replace Kira with Coppola at least for a month or so, just to try and mix things up, because Merfolk doesn't really change that much. But I do think that Coppola has a chance of seeing long-term play if Blue-Green Merfolk catches on. And even though Blue-Green Merfolk seems kind of out there because it's always been Mono-Blue Merfolk and nothing else, we did have some success with Blue-Green Merfolk using Noble Hierarch, Collected Company, and Choke in the sideboard, which is a bit of a stretch, but it was pretty cool. And with Noble Hierarch and Collected Company in the deck, it feels like the Blue-Green Merfolk version can be more aggressive than the Mono-Blue version. And since we're on the topic of Blue-Green Merfolk, that brings us to our next card that has potential to see modern play, and that card is Commendeth Speaker. It's essentially a 2/2 for 1, which isn't all that great, but I do think it has some potential at replacing Curse Catcher to make Merfolk more aggressive, because Curse Catcher kind of just feels like a card that's there to fill out the mana curve, and the only time it's really good is when it delays Anger of the Gods a turn or Wrath of the God a turn. But other than those 2 scenarios, I really don't like Curse Catcher all that much. So in Blue-Green Merfolk builds, I think I'd rather have Commendeth Speaker over Curse Catcher. And since we're on the topic of tribal, let's talk about our next card, Unclaimed Territory. In almost all tribal decks, Unclaimed Territory will not see any play, and that's because we have a better version of this card, Cavernous Souls, but most tribal decks don't even use 4 Cavernous Souls and instead opt for 2 or 3. But I do think that this card may have some potential in 5-color Slivers, and that's because Slivers already runs 4 Cavernous Souls and 4 Sliver Hides, and if we throw in a few Unclaimed Territories, that opens the door to using Reflecting Pool, which, along with the other lands, can produce 1 mana of any color. And all of these lands would make it quite easy to play Sliver Hive Lord and Sliver Legion, both of which cost 1 mana of every color. The only downside to this is that the card Sedge Sliver only works if you have a swamp out. So if Unclaimed Territory and Reflecting Pool don't see play in Slivers, I think that Sedge Sliver will be to blame for that. The remaining Ixalan cards that I want to talk about in this video, I am going to move a bit faster through, because although I think there's a chance they'll see play, I think that this next bunch of cards will see play in fringe decks as opposed to top tier decks. The first card of the bunch is Sirens Storm Tamer, which I'm pretty excited about because not only is its ability pretty good, but it's also a wizard. And tribal wizards in Modern isn't quite a thing just yet, but with some pretty good wizard cards, it's heading in that direction. And if Modern Wizards does become a thing, Sirens Storm Tamer would be a good card for that deck. We also have Shaper's Sanctuary, which might see play in something like Elves, as a sideboard card against decks that target a lot of creatures. Next, we have Tocatli Honor Guard. If Splinter Twin were still a thing in Modern, this card would definitely see play, but even without Splinter Twin, there are a few cards this card works well with. We also have Settle the Wreckage, which I doubt will see play, but I'm sure that somebody out there will use it with Leonin Arbiter, and that will be pretty sweet. There's also Blood Crazed Paladin, which I don't really think is that good, but Tribal Knight decks are pretty good, except it's missing a few cards that fill out the curve, and Blood Crazed Knight could help things out there. There's one last card I want to mention before saving the rest for the next video, and that is the new Jace card. Its first ability, bad. Its second ability, terrible. But if you have Doubling Season out when you play it, you can use its last ability on the turn that you play it, and get infinite Jace cards, and in turn get infinite illusion tokens. But I do want to save the rest of the cards for the next video for when all the spoilers for Ixalan are released, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that video. And also, all the decks that I mentioned in passing here, like Blue-Red 3 the Breach, Blue Moon, Blue-Green, Merfolk, I'll be posting videos on all those decks as soon as Ixalan comes out, and it will be pretty gangster. But for now, that's all. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a great day.